Welcome back. We are Living Proof, Experience as Evidence in Pain Research, where people who live with pain get to ask the questions and guide the conversation instead of just answering the surveys. We are your hosts, Desmond Williams and Emerald Asuncion.
Our timing could not have been more aligned in releasing part one of this episode on the very same day as a potential threat and attack on EDI initiatives was made by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Science and Research. So, thanks for coming. If just arriving, this is part two of episode 2. So please check out part 1 for full context from the beginning of this rich conversation with community researcher Mehmoona Moosa-Mitha and engaged marginalized power expertise and representation with PEPR Empower Committee member Jenny Lorca.
So I just want to pass it back over to Emerald as we move on to our next topic for inclusive language.
Oh, yeah, it's funny because I actually skipped past it and I went to the next one by accident. And I was thinking that what you were saying was also leading into structural violence because the creation of the machines, that in itself is a system, a structure of violence, of racism within it. But it's okay. We can circle back to that later. We'll have we'll just get into some lighter things, which are none of it's light, but yeah, and I feel you in trying to, show up as someone else. It's not that I want to be someone else, but it was that I just wanted to make it clear and aware to you both that that I care, that I'm doing my homework, that I can offer curiosity towards your work. And as you mentioned, reading papers is difficult, but I did it. And really what came out of this was you have so many amazing projects. In my mind, it was a world of acronyms. I was trying to write them all down so I could be like, oh, let's ask about this, let's talk about this. And then I look at my list and it's a bunch of acronyms. And so we can take it back to inclusive language and how that is accessible to the people who want to or need to hear about your work. So I wanted you, if you can, to describe some of the acronyms that mean the most to you in your work right now. There was EQUIP framework, and then there was so you don't have to if you don't want to. But that's what I mean. We can take it from the perspective of being accessible in the work. You have so many things that you've worked on that are relatable to certain spaces, but how do we bring that knowledge into practice across our roles in society? How do you see that happening?
You're asking me?
Yeah, I love how I said one acronym and you're like, ew, I did that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think EQUIP is a really good framework, but I have a problem of thinking of my work in terms of acronyms because they are not inclusive, right? Because they're an acronym. People have to go find out what they actually mean, right? So yeah, that's my reaction, though it's nothing about EQUIP itself, which I think is doing amazing work. But the bigger question of how do I, in my work, make sure that inclusivity is primary or central to my work? And it's such a good question, and it's such a struggle because there's always a layer I find of people that are not being included. It is not as obvious as you would think to know who is not being included. And I was very struck by something you said, Jenny, when you said that pain can be invisible. And also pain can invisibilize, so that you see people only in a particular way if they're in pain, if you see them at all. So all the examples that Jenny and I have given are examples of how inclusivity does not occur because either you see the patient as a victim, only somebody in pain and not as agentic, in fact, because patients are very dynamic in their encounters with the healthcare system. And so, it's a point of invisibility that wasn't clear to me until I was doing this research. So I want to start with what I don't know. Like Jenny said, what is the question? And I always, in my work now, after doing it for so many years, start with the question of, what don't I know about who else is being invisibilized. I no longer take it as obvious. I used to think it was obvious because, BIPOC people are invisibilized, queer people are being, but it's not clear because it's complex. And then I want to know what are the levels of invisibility and how do they work? So, for example, very clear that a refugee immigrant person is being invisibilized in the office when she's meeting with her physician. I know that this is going to happen. I know it from so many people in that position who tell me. So there's a story of this person I meet, my research participant, and she's a refugee. And she tells me that I was in pain. I went chronic pain, went in to see the physician who was wanting to be a good physician. So he had an interpreter with him. And he said to me, unfortunately, it was a him. And he said to me, don't worry, we'll understand your experiences of pain because we have an interpreter. And so she started telling her story. And at some point in her story, she said, the pain is so bad, I would rather that I was dead. And the interpreter interpreted that to mean that she wanted to kill herself. And so the physician responded through a psychiatric intervention. She was put in a hospital. She'd just come out after 4 years. And she lost her children. Children were taken into care, all because of a misinterpretation. Now, that is invisibilization at a level I had never known. I had not realized that, oh my God, even an interpreter can invisibilize. And why was the interpreter heard over her protestations? Because she said, then I switched to English and I kept saying, I don't want to die. That's not what I'm saying. And I wasn't heard. Well, because the interpreter is bilingual, speaks English, credibility is given to that person over somebody who doesn't speak English. So there's so many levels at which inclusion and exclusion occurs. So that's where I would start first, Emerald. And then I would say it's a constant struggle. So I used to do research. Now I only do community-based participatory action research. It's the only way I do research because I will not talk to people. And, the saying, nothing about us without us. And I've really learned that. So I do my inclusionary work by knowing if I'm completely surprised and come apart, that this is good work. Because the work's getting undone every time that community speaks, and I'm getting to know about them with them. It's very difficult because either if you keep getting immersed in a community who talks about their, let's say, experiences of pain and exclusion, and you get so immersed that you run into the danger of becoming the expert. And that's something I really have to make sure and be aware about, because it never does make me. I should always be the learner. There are so many pitfalls. Or you do the opposite. So I was working with one community of ultra poor people. Ultra poverty is a bad term that the World Bank uses for the 2% most poor. And because I wanted to be inclusionary, I kept saying to that community, oh, you know best, and you should do this research the way you want to do it, until one young man just kind of stood up and said, I'm so fed up of you keep saying that we are the experts. We are experts at our lived experience. You have the expertise of research methodology. You don't have to hide that expertise. It doesn't make us stronger. So I was like, oh, whew, thank goodness, So it's a very dynamic relationship between knowing and not knowing, and how to make your knowledge count without, the colonial theorists call it pluriversalities, that we have pluralities of truths. And we have to be very comfortable with that and not hiding my voice doesn't actually help anyone else. Having my voice count brings out the light, shines the light on somebody else's voice. So it's a very complex and very interesting thing, this thing about inclusionary. But I also want to say it's very energizing. I don't know if you really appreciate how dreadful it is to just sit in your study and weave things from your mind and write them down with other people who are academics reading it, and the world is not at all interested in it. Like, that's very deadening, So this has been really energizing. But I also don't see inclusionary as something just around language. I see that it is much more embedded in society, and that racism is an everyday part of life, and it is a part of who I am too, that I have to constantly question and be aware of. So I try to be inclusionary, but not just on an individual level or even with my participants on a communal level. I mean, I face it everywhere, in the university, in the school, when I go to do grocery shopping, when I see a person who is clearly disabled trying to articulate something and the cashier being disgruntled by that. It's everywhere, So it's complex.
I guess I'm hearing the part where it excites you, it inspires you, it gives you energy. And I'm thinking about how weaving these narratives together inspire ideas for how we can express that into the world. Do you have any ideas that you want to see put forth through the mobilization of this knowledge that you've spent so much time and energy cultivating?
I mean, this podcast is a very good creative way of doing it. So thank you for that. Um, a lot of things. I really love it when community comes to voice on a project, and then they go out and meet their own community members to expand the horizon of the people listening. And then they get feedback. And because they live in this embodied space of give and take, that knowledge becomes bigger, but then they go to a bigger community to talk about it. That has actually happened. I have actually seen that happen in some of my work around trauma, where community that are traumatized. And what I really love about that work is not only are they doing this, like we said, we're not talking to the center. Community is talking to community. And it's so much more meaningful, right? We're not defending, we're not translating, we're not explaining, and we're bloody well not educating. We're just talking. And it's so amazing when I've seen that happen in when we're talking about communities that have faced trauma and how they explain it to others and how that just grows. But what I really loved about it is they've seen it as healing. And they talk about this way of mobilizing knowledge is not separate from a process of healing. And I think Jenny and Desmond and even you, Emerald, like just from the little bit that you've talked about, have you have enacted with knowledge and knowledge mobilization, and how that has been both healing as well as research, right? And that has really moved me. I mean, just to watch a kid who had such a hard time talking to me about his trauma, then go to his community and talk about that. I am never very sure how much I want to educate the dominant. That's my difficulty with when you ask me that question. Today, my answer is that I'm way more invested in the community owning their knowledge and growing their knowledge. Of course, we have to. I'm in an institution. So the other way I make this knowledge inclusive to others is my students. It's not so much the papers, though I do like writing papers and I do write them, but it's really with the students. I watch their practices change. I'm in the field of social work. So there is an immediate practice element to it. We work with practitioners in the community and we decolonize. We talk about our work at the university and say to these practitioners, here's what we're finding. Here's what we want you to assess in our students. We don't want you to assess, oh, can they do an interview well? We want you to assess whether do they understand power relationships? Do they understand their own subject positionality, how it interrelates with how they see their client? We ask very different questions. So, many ways. Thank God there are many ways.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Jenny, do you have anything to add? Or I saw so many hands and so bad and notes. And I was just like waiting to hear what else too.
My body processes things before my it catches up with my brain catches up. One of the things I thought of, Mehmoona, when you were talking about the expansiveness of community was how fan fiction evolves.
Yeah.
Right? From its source, and how the audience, the consumers, take it up and make it into something completely their own and their own subculture. I was also thinking about, like, Desmond and I, we took this course with Alberta Spore Unit, and it was a partnership between Alberta Spore Unit and the Chronic Pain Network on digital storytelling. And there were 9 of us who came together from across Canada, and we learned this digital platform that incorporated multimedia, voice-over, sound, images, video. And then we collectively brainstormed on a theme, and then we went off various times to do our project, would come back, check in. And at the end of this 6 or 8 week process, we had these 3 to set. Mine was 7 minutes because I just can't stop talking apparently. But these videos that were a very small piece of how we experienced our body, or how we experienced our sense of identity in chronic pain. And even that was up for debate. Is it chronic pain and identity, or chronic pain on identity? Even those tiny nuances were being deliberated because those small words were just so important. I was thinking in my homework and looking up PEPR and all of the projects that you were doing, I came across one of the infographics that you recently published and saw with great joy the difference between the acronym PWLE, people with lived experience, versus people with situated experience. And that lit me the frack up because yeah, it doesn't take into, as you were saying, Mehmoona, the positionality. It doesn't take into power. It doesn't take into our environment. It doesn't take into how we interact with it and how others and the environment interact with us. And that makes it dynamic. Right? And not to say that lived or living experience isn't dynamic, but that makes it much more broader. And that goes to the very beginning of what I said with respect to, like, how my experience of pain wasn't like specifically individual anymore, but a collective, as part of a collective. So to go to the beginning of your question, Emerald, of like, what does inclusive language look like or feel like? That certainly felt like something impactful to me. And I don't think we think about or feel about how we feel about language, how our body, like how our embodied knowledge and wisdom feels about certain language. And I'm noticing, like, even in, to go back to like colonialist structures, even in like applying for a grant, for example, and how I have to like write a CV in order to justify my existence, and looking at how, or sitting with, these offers or these invitations that come my way, am I sitting with the yeses and the nos? Sitting with, like, is this something that I want to devote my energy and attention to? And learning to really listen to the minutia of the decision making that my body makes for me before my brain does. So, does that make sense? I know, I think it makes sense. I'm talking to like people, right? So I'm pretty sure that makes sense.
100%. I actually just had a moment of thinking that, like, we jumped into conversation hot with like the understanding that we're kind of at the same level of awareness. We've done our homeworks and our inner works and all of that. But other people could be jumping into this conversation and hearing all of these brand new words.
Indeed.
And Yeah, they can Google it. As you said, you're not committed to teaching those people. Yeah. Yeah. I've had a time in life where I've said, there's nothing I can say out loud that you can't already Google that someone has like clearly articulated. Why reinvent the wheel? Yeah.
Do your own work. This is what we are doing. We're doing our work. Do your own. I think many of us, all of us in this room, have borne that burden of doing work for others, because we got invited, right? Like because we're just so thankful, and to have that door opened for us. And Desmond, I think you've said this before, not today, but in another conversation. It's like, well, fine, I'm going to just walk right through that door. I'm going to take all my friends with me, and I'm going to take up all the space in this room as I walk in. Good. We should. It's our right.
You're like, is there a back room? I know you have a stack of chairs. There's more of us.
Yeah, if you invited me, I will be coming. Thank you for the invite. And, it's really interesting how this particular subject, we started with the idea of like acronyms and how that is a component of inclusivity, but it's also a major component of exclusivity, where like when you get into the land of acronyms, how it is an institutional structure that we work with. And when we define ourselves, one of the really interesting things that Emerald and I came across in 2021, working on our community capacity building project with SFU, was as we were building our presentation, working through the language that we were using as we presented, we were stuck on BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, which is still the most commonly used definition acronym for people with melanin in their skin. And for me, there was always this issue where like I am a Black and Indigenous person of color, so like that's me, fantastic. But I always felt like why are these the only ones that get mentioned? And also the POC aspect of it, just like as we get deep into the semantics of language, to me, that sounds like there are people, and then there are people of color. And so, like, that in itself, in the definition, lessens us. Like we define ourselves as POCs, but then it's like, but why can't we just be people? And so it was so interesting because we talked about it extensively when we were preparing for our presentation about how we felt about it, how it felt weird, but we just did not have the language for it. And it was like less than 5 days after we had finished our presentation where I was introduced to the language of people of the global majority, which is, one, it's not an acronym. This is a statement. And it is an acknowledgement of the fact that there are a lot more melanated people in the world, people of color, than there are people who don't have melanin in their skin. And so with that, it, to a certain extent, is a taking back of power, of identity, of how we exist in this world. Not like we're not minorities. Individually, even as Black people or brown people, still not minorities individually, and together we're not at all. We are very much people of the global majority. And so it is so interesting how sometimes we think that we've come up with the perfect definition. We created the acronym and it's like, yes, we've made it easy for people to digest. And then, like, as the conversation continues to evolve, we dig deeper into how we really feel about the language that we're using in this moment, that we find that new space to be like, no, you know what? This is something that feels a lot better for me. And I think that in us being able to have these conversations together opens up that space for that dialogue to continue to grow and evolve so that we can find those new ways to define ourselves, to take ownership of who we are and where we stand in positionality of the rest of the world, and how when we're within these institutions and we feel as though we are less than or that we have to fight against this major structure, that this structure was built this way specifically. I've seen it many different spaces. The system isn't broken. This is exactly how it was built. And so this is something that we have to acknowledge as we work within these systems and as we work to, either dismantle or restructure these systems to find a better foundation to build off of. But it's so interesting how we often will get caught up in these language semantics of what is the cleanest acronym or definition of that moment, even if it doesn't feel right for us. And as an example, our presentation in 2021, that we said BIPOC like 37 times in our 10-minute presentation. And it was like, and it felt bad to say it every single time, but we said it because that was the language we had at that moment. And it wasn't until a week later that language evolved. But like, it's not like we're able to go back and erase that and rewrite our whole presentation. And it's not like I'm ashamed that I shared that I identified as a BIPOC at that time. And so there's certain components of like, we can own the language we have, the definitions we have, but recognizing also that there is space for us to evolve, to grow into it, and as we understand our position just that much more in depth.
You actually just reminded me even of the way people acknowledge indigeneity and how that has evolved. And then, what's the word I'm looking for?
With the language of indigeneity, like the fact that we are still within the structure of Canada, and as an Indigenous person, if you have your status, you are under the Indian Act, still defined as an Indian by the government, despite the fact that nowhere else is that accepted language, but because it's under the Indian Act. The Department of Indian Services, or whatever they call themselves right now, and how there's like these different definitions where if you are a reservation, you are an Indian, but if you are a sovereign nation like Sawasan, maybe you are a First Nation. It's not an Indian Act agreement. And so they have found ways to be autonomous and use their definition of language, but like those of us who are still within the structure of the Canadian government are Indians and have an Indian status card. And this is in 2025. And so it really is amazing how like we're still working through the language of definition within the structure of the entire country of how we define our first peoples, the people who were here for time immemorial and have been affected by the structures of colonization since the first contact, but are still referred to as Indians based off of Columbus, who never came to North America, being confused about where he was in the world. And so it's amazing how, just within the structure of all the things that we work with in this country that we live in, just the foundation of language of who it is, whose land we are on. To get into the last topic that we will talk about together today, at least, who knows, maybe we'll all come together again for an extension of this conversation. But it's something that we have kind of hinted at, touched on a few times through the conversation, and it's the idea of the structural violence that we live in within the idea of colonialism, within the systems of institution that we work in and live in. And so for those who aren't as familiar with the term, I'm wondering if maybe we'll start with Jenny for this one, if maybe you'd be interested in sharing some of your perspectives or your viewpoint on what you believe is your definition of structural violence.
Well, see, I didn't get that far in my research. I think this goes back to what I'd said earlier about feeling like I have to do work in order to make myself sound smart because I didn't feel like I was enough. I think that when you first invited me to be a part of this conversation, I was like, yes. And then I thought, oh God, what am I going to say about EDID? Sorry, equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And then I realized that to go back to the whole acronym inclusive language, and that also includes structural violence part, that this concept is not the reason why I have such a hard time with concepts such as structural violence and EDID is that it's very academized and intellectualized for me. It's not in my body. And so, for me to be able to recognize, acknowledge, name, call out, call in, teach, invite myself and others to talk about what structural violence is, it's tough because I'm living it, right? Aren't we all living it? So it's sort of like, I feel like a fish in a fishbowl. Where's the water in many ways? So for me, it's hard for me to talk about because I'm still trying to figure my way through it. I had said earlier, like, I'm still trying to disentangle myself from what my biases are. I'm still trying to figure out, like, what is my voice and not the voices of others, and whose voices are they? Are they my parents? Are they like the white teachers who told my parents not to teach their kids English, right? When they got here. It's the voices of, the history of nurses being the nurses are the handmaidens of the doctors. Like, and to go back to Mehmoona talking about what you had said about who are the people with the privilege who are making those decisions about people's lives and how their health trajectories should be. And it's certainly not the people who are living it. I don't know what else to say about that.
Well, and it's still well said, because the fish in the fishbowl, where's the water, really stood out to me, because it's one of those things that we experience collectively as oppressed people, where it's like, where is the fight and what part of it do I engage with? And like, for some of us, maybe we used to be warriors, we used to be fighters, but we've chosen a more peaceful path. And so where do we fit in with that? And it really is, it's one of those topics, one of those ideas of such complexity, because we are currently, like, in real time dealing with the impacts and the effects of the structural violence, while trying to exist as we are, while trying to reconnect with our culture and our language and a true sense of what our identity really is as we exist in this space within a colonized land that still is struggling to be acknowledged as that. And it really is just so difficult to navigate that existence. But I appreciate that, we're here together today to find some help or support, and to be able to navigate these conversations, these ideas together, because it really is the dialogues that we get to have together in our own space that allows us to move the dialogue forward, the perspective forward, and also to recognize that we aren't alone in the process of struggling through this on a day-to-day, and that, that's also an acknowledgement of the extra weight that we carry as people who deal with the effects of colonization, and how we're dealing with the effects and also trying to do the work to circumnavigate the whole institution and get to exist as we are and contribute in meaningful ways. But it really, I just want to bring it back to the fish in the fishbowl metaphor, Jenny. That was really succinct in how it feels to live this existence in the many layers of structures that are around us. I'm curious, Mehmoona, if you had any closing thoughts on the idea, the language, the existence that we're in here with structural violence.
Thank you, Jenny. Actually, I loved that analogy of the fish in the fishbowl. It says it all, really does, in such an embodied way, which is always the way, you know? But anyway, yeah. So structural violence. So we, as you said, Jenny and Desmond, you also repeated that in beautifully. We experience it every day, all the time. It's taken for granted. It's a taken for grantedness. I feel that you're the problem. You're the problem in so many ways. So, oh, you're in pain. So you're the problem called pain. You become collapsed um, into that one identity. And me, first of all, living in a neoliberal environment where everything is about personal achievement and pursuit of self-interest, and if you can't do that, then you're out. It's all you. It's all you. It's all you who are being the problem. That to me is structural violence, first of all. That thinking that so many of us have internalized. I'm the first one. Like, I wrote 4 pages of notes for today. I was telling Desmond as we started, oh my God, I'm overdoing it. It's the same thing, Jenny, as you're talking about. Is like, I'm the problem. I have to solve it by writing the most beautiful thing I can ever write, right? Like, I, really? you know, everything about my way of being contradicts that, but it's what we internalize, right? That we have to do better and better and better. That to me, that neoliberal ideology is the first structural violence because of how much we internalize it. That's one thing I wanted to say. And I also wanted to say, because you talked so beautifully about language and BIPOC. By the way, I used BIPOC 5 times today. I was like, oh no. But good point. I agree totally with the point. I wanted to say, let's just take pain. Like, language is a huge structure and it does such violence. So pain is defined in such violent ways because it's individualized, it's all about the brain and the body. And then decolonial theorists come along and say, actually, pain is the visceral effect of colonization. And suddenly it's collective, like you said, Jenny, and it's not about how my body is reacting to some transmitter that's telling me that I'm uncomfortable. Like, how silly that sounds now, right? So I guess what I want to say is colonization is also culturicide. It's also epistemicide. And language is a huge structure. It's constantly telling us how we should define ourselves, our pain, our identities in normative ways. And decolonial theories say that structure is violent. It's called racism. It's called sexism, etc. And so what we need to do is we need to always be very suspicious about normative definitions. With my students, the big thing I teach them in class is, okay, immigration. What is the normative definition of the immigrant? And then I tell them the story of immigrants talking about being immigrants. And what a different story that is. And then I say, this is violence, this very definition. So I would just want to, from everything you said, Jenny, I just want to add that structures are so hard to define. We know that colonization is structural and that it is violent. But where is that structure? It's exactly the fishbowl and fish thing, The big structure we swim in is the language that we use. And the other one's historical amnesia. A huge process of structural violence is the covering up of the tracks of colonization. It happens all the time. And we've touched upon it today, but I just want to remind us that how we rationalize the mistreatment of people, even to the point of seeing them as subhuman for rational reasons, for scientific reasons, like we talked about. And that kind of rationalization, that kind of amnesia of how colonization actually happened. No, you didn't save us and civilize us. And no, it was not an empty piece of land that you came to, is another way that I try and uncover structural violence for my students. And they're so shocked when they look at so many things historically. Like they buy into, even indigenous students will tell me, we bought into the story that we didn't know how to farm, that we didn't actually have farming practices, when in fact, indigenous farming practices went from here all the way to Mexico. Indigenous peoples farmed. I mean, I don't want to rationalize because they farmed, they were civilized. I'm not falling into that trap, but just not knowing that. And so, how we rationalize our colonial acts is another form of structural violence that I just wanted to bring up. And I don't want to bring up any more because I got to go.
I so greatly appreciate, one of the first points that you made about, you could say, the colonial component of individuality, and how this addressing your pain, managing your pain, all is an individual experience, an individual responsibility. Whereas when we look at it from all of our respective cultures, you look around the world, that community support, the support of others, of the village, is how we maintain our well-being, our wellness, and manage our different components of pain, is by being together, by working on it together, by having the conversations, by seeking help and asking for help, because that's another component that we've convinced ourselves within colonialization, that asking for help is a weakness. Whereas, I mean, from my Filipino friends and family, the Kapwa mindset of like, I exist because you exist.
Yeah.
And like we are all a different expression of the same energy. And it really is something that in the conversation within institutions, within universities, isn't something that's really considered, that this need that we have for connecting together is a part of how we're going to be managing our pain individually, but managing our pain as communities and as a greater sense, like as a country, because it is something that we have to work on together. And we all have our own unique individual skill sets, our strengths, and the things that we know that we need help with. And it comes from finding these connections, having these conversations, and recognizing just how amazing all the people are around us and how much they can support us and help us when we stop thinking of ourselves of this master of whatever. Because everyone has such a depth of experience and uniqueness that there's so much to contribute from every corner, and there's so much to learn at every moment. So I'm just so grateful that we got a chance to have this conversation, that we got a chance to come together to really flesh out some of these ideas, to be able to speak freely in a way that maybe sometimes we don't get the chance to within certain spaces and within public spaces. And so I thank you for being genuine, being honest, using colorful language at times, because that's how we portray like how deeply we feel about these ideas and these subjects. And I'm just so grateful to get to be a witness and to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. I am so grateful too.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thanks for your lightness, your tears, your depth. It was a really great conversation, and I hope everyone feels at ease for the rest of their day.
Thank
Because of it.
you.
Yes.
Bye, Jenny. Thank you.
Bye, Mehmoona. See you again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you
Bye,
so
Bye,
everyone.
much.
everyone. Thank you, Desmond.
Thanks,
Jenny.
Emma. Bye. Bye, Desmond.
Bye, Mehmoona.